She looked directly at Blackwell. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Blackwell Properties not only failed to engage in good faith negotiations as required by the contract, but actively avoided any substantive communication with Mrs. Chen for 18 months following her husband's death. The first and only communication was a demand letter threatening legal action. That is not good faith. That is the antithesis of good faith. I felt Jenny grab my hand, squeezing so hard it hurt. Furthermore, the evidence regarding the zoning variance is deeply troubling. Mr. Blackwell obtained a variance that allowed him to increase the development size by 50%, a variance that was granted in part based on the landscaping work that David Chen had completed before his death. Mr. Blackwell then proceeded to sue Mrs. Chen for failing to complete that same work, seeking damages that far exceed the actual cost of completion. Judge Reynolds paused, letting her words sink in. The testimony of Mr. Morton established a pattern of behavior suggesting that this was not an isolated incident, but rather a business strategy, using litigation as a weapon against smaller contractors who lack the resources to fight back effectively. David Chen's letter, written before his death, suggests he may have sensed Mr. Blackwell's willingness to manipulate situations for financial gain. Victoria Hastings was gripping her pen so hard I thought it might snap. Having considered all of this evidence, I find that Blackwell Properties materially breached the good faith negotiation clause of the contract. I further find that the damages sought are excessive, punitive, and unconscionable given the circumstances and given Mr. Blackwell's substantial profit from the situation. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Margaret Chen. Blackwell Properties' claim for damages is dismissed in its entirety. Furthermore, I am awarding Mrs. Chen compensatory damages in the amount of $50,000 for intentional infliction of emotional distress, plus attorney's fees and costs. The courtroom erupted. Jenny was crying, Sarah was hugging me, people in the gallery were applauding. Through the noise and commotion, I saw Richard Blackwell's face, frozen in shock and fury, his carefully constructed world suddenly tilted on its axis. Judge Reynolds banged her gavel. Order. I'm not finished. The room quieted. Mr. Blackwell, I want to be very clear about something. You came into this courtroom expecting to financially destroy a widow because you believed you had the legal right and the financial resources to do so. You were wrong on both counts. The law does not exist solely to protect the wealthy and powerful. It exists to provide justice, especially, when that means holding the wealthy and powerful accountable for their actions. She removed her glasses, looking at Blackwell with an expression I can only describe as profound disappointment. You had every opportunity to handle this situation with grace and compassion. You could have called Mrs. Chen personally after her husband died. You could have worked with her to find a solution. You could have acknowledged that you were profiting enormously from David Chen's work while simultaneously suing his widow into bankruptcy. Instead, you chose cruelty. You chose exploitation. And now you're facing the consequences of those choices. Blackwell stood suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Your Honor, this is. Sit down, Mr. Blackwell. I'm not finished. You will pay Mrs. Chen the $50,000 in damages within 30 days. You will pay her attorney's fees in full within 60 days. And if I ever see another case like this in my courtroom, if I ever again see you or your company using litigation as a weapon against vulnerable contractors, I will not be nearly as restrained in my rulings. Do you understand me? Blackwell didn't answer, his face purple with rage. Do you understand me, Mr. Blackwell? Yes, Your Honor, he ground out through clenched teeth. Good. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and suddenly Sarah and Jenny were both hugging me, and I was crying great, heaving sobs that I couldn't control, 2 years of grief and fear and anger pouring out of me all at once. You won, Mom, Jenny kept saying. You won. Dad would be so proud. Through my tears, I saw Blackwell storm out of the courtroom, Victoria Hastings and his other lawyers scrambling to follow, and I thought, no, Jenny, we didn't just win. We made him lose. There's a difference. The news of the verdict spread quickly. By that evening, it was in the local newspapers. By the next day, it had been picked up by regional outlets. Widow defeats billionaire developer in landmark case. The headlines read, Judge lambasts wealthy developer for exploitation of grieving widow. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanting interviews. Other contractors who'd been victimized by Blackwell wanting to know if they could sue too. Well-wishers from the community calling to congratulate me. It was overwhelming and exhausting and wonderful all at once. Sarah called 3 days after the verdict with news. Margaret, you're not going to believe this. Blackwell's lawyers contacted me. They want to settle. Settle what? We already won. No, I mean, remember we filed a counterclaim for bad faith dealing and emotional distress? The judge awarded you $50,000, but our counterclaim was actually for much more. They're offering $250,000 to settle the counterclaim and avoid any further litigation. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, the same chair where this whole nightmare had started when I'd opened that first demand letter. Why would they do that? Because the verdict made them look terrible. Because other contractors are already reaching out to me asking about class action lawsuits. Because Judge Reynolds essentially put them on notice that she'll be watching their behavior going forward. They want this to go away, Margaret. They want you to sign an NDA and disappear. What do you think I should do? Sarah was quiet for a moment. Honestly? Take the money. You've already won the moral victory. The legal victory. You've proven that David was right to worry, that Blackwell was manipulative and cruel. Now take the money and rebuild your life. You've earned it. I thought about David, about his letter, about his worry that Blackwell would somehow take everything we'd built and twist it into something ugly and commercial. Tell them I'll take the $250,000, I said slowly, but I won't sign an NDA. They can't buy my silence. If other contractors want to know what happened, if reporters want to write about it, I'm going to tell the truth. They won't like that. I don't care what they like. Do you think they'll still settle? Let me find out. They did. Blackwell's lawyers agreed to the $250,000 settlement without the NDA, probably calculating that fighting over it would generate even more negative publicity. The money was in my account within 2 weeks. With the settlement money, plus the damages award, plus the attorney's fees, I had enough to save the house, pay off the mortgage, and still have money left over. Enough to live on while I figured out what to do next. I decided to close Chen's Landscaping. It was too painful to try to keep running it without David, and besides, the business had been his vision, his artistry. Tom understood. He'd already found a job with another landscaping company, and he thanked me for fighting, for proving that David's work had meant something. But I didn't stop working with plants. I started volunteering at the community garden at the Chinese Community Center, teaching people how to grow vegetables and herbs, sharing the knowledge David had shared with me over 32 years of marriage. It wasn't landscaping on the scale David had done, but it felt meaningful. It felt like honoring his legacy in a way that was true to who he'd been. Jenny came home for Christmas that year, the first Christmas since David died that hadn't felt completely hollow. We decorated the house together, including the garden with lights strung through David's Japanese maple, illuminating the branches he'd so carefully cultivated. On Christmas Eve, we went to visit David's grave. I brought a small spruce tree in a pot, planning to plant it there in the spring. I fought for you, I whispered, kneeling on the frozen ground. I fought for everything you built. And I won, David. We won. Jenny knelt beside me, adding her own flowers to the arrangement I'd brought. Dad always said you were stronger than you thought you were, Mom. He was right. I thought about that, about strength, about resilience, about the difference between giving up and letting go. I'd spent so much of the past 2 years feeling weak, feeling like I was failing, feeling like I wasn't enough to fill the void David had left. But I'd stood up to Richard Blackwell. I'd fought a man with infinite resources, and I'd won. Not because I was some superhero or legal genius, but because I'd refused to accept injustice. Because I'd found allies like Sarah and James Morton who believed that some fights were worth fighting even when the odds were terrible. 3 months later, in early March, I got a phone call from a woman named Diane Richardson. She explained that she was a contractor who'd been sued by Blackwell Properties 5 years earlier for allegedly failing to complete electrical work on a commercial project. I saw the news about your case, she said. I read what Judge Reynolds said about patterns of behavior. And I thought, maybe I don't have to live with what happened to me. Maybe I can fight back too. Did you settle with Blackwell? I asked. Yes. He buried me in legal fees until I couldn't afford to keep fighting. But I never signed an NDA. I can still talk about what happened. Then talk, I said. Tell your story. I'll support you however I can. Over the next few months, more contractors came forward. Sarah started working on a class action lawsuit against Blackwell Properties, alleging a pattern of fraudulent contract manipulation and litigation abuse. I gave interviews to local news outlets, telling David's story and my story and urging other victims to come forward. Richard Blackwell tried to fight back, of course. His lawyers sent cease and desist letters, threatening defamation suits. But Sarah had been right. The verdict had put him in a vulnerable position. Every aggressive move he made just generated more negative publicity. And slowly, gradually, things began to change. The Connecticut Contractors Association started offering free legal consultations for members facing litigation from larger companies. State legislators introduced bills to prevent litigation abuse in construction and development contracts. It wasn't a revolution, but it was something. A small crack in the wall that had always protected the wealthy and powerful at the expense of small businesses and working people. None of it brought David back, of course. I still woke up sometimes in the middle of the night, reaching for him in the dark, forgetting for a moment that he was gone. I still cried sometimes while cooking his favorite meals or working in the garden he'd created. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in the 2 years since his death. Pride. Pride in what we'd built together. Pride in the fight I'd fought to honor his legacy. Pride in being the kind of person who stands up even when standing up seems impossible. 1 year after the verdict, on a crisp October Saturday, I was working in the community garden when Sarah called. Margaret, I have news. The class action against Blackwell settled. $4.2 million to be distributed among 15 contractors he'd sued or threatened over the past decade. It's not everything they lost, but it's something. It's acknowledgement that what he did was wrong. That's wonderful, I said, pulling off my #Billionaire laughed at the widowed mother, but the lawyer's secret turntables. I'll never forget the sound of Richard Blackwell's laughter that day in the mahogany-paneled conference room. Cold, dismissive, like I was nothing more than an inconvenient piece of lint he'd found on his $1,000 suit. He sat there, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his silver cufflinks catching the autumn light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his attorney's office on Fifth Avenue. The kind of office where even the air smells expensive, like leather-bound law books and old money. And there I was, a 57-year-old widow in a Macy's clearance rack blazer, holding a manila folder with trembling hands, about to lose everything my late husband David had worked his entire life to build. Mrs. Chun, Richard said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that comes from never having worried about a mortgage payment in your entire life. Let me make this abundantly clear. Your husband's little landscaping company signed a contract. A binding legal contract. You don't have a leg to stand on. His lawyer, a sharp-featured woman named Victoria something or other with a helmet of blonde hair that probably cost more to maintain than my monthly grocery bill, nodded along like a bobblehead on a dashboard. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. Let me tell you how I ended up in that room, facing down one of Connecticut's most ruthless real estate developers, with nothing but a prayer and a lawyer I'd found through a friend of a friend who worked at the Chinese Community Center in Bridgeport. It started 6 months earlier, on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other Tuesday in the 2 years since David had passed. The thing about grief is that it doesn't hit you all at once. It's not like in the movies, where the widow collapses at the funeral and then slowly rebuilds her life with the help of quirky friends and maybe a pottery class. No, grief is a sneaky beast. It waits. It lets you think you're doing okay, that you're managing, that you've got this whole widow thing figured out. And then it strikes when you're standing in the produce section of Stop and Shop, holding a bunch of cilantro, suddenly unable to remember why you even came to the store in the first place. That's where I was, metaphorically speaking, when the letter arrived. I was in my kitchen, The same kitchen where David and I had shared 32 years of morning coffee and late-night talks about our daughter Jenny's college applications and whether we should finally replace that avocado green refrigerator from 1987. The same kitchen where I'd learned to make his mother's pot stickers from scratch, even though I'd burned the first 3 batches so badly that we'd had to air out the house for days. The envelope was thick, official-looking. The return address read, Blackwell Properties LLC, followed by an address in Greenwich that probably had more square footage than my entire neighborhood. My hands shook as I opened it. I'd been getting a lot of official mail since David died: insurance companies, the mortgage lender, the business accounts. Each envelope felt like a small bomb waiting to explode in my face, with some new responsibility I didn't understand, some new proof that I was failing at being a widow, failing at keeping David's legacy alive. But this one was different. Dear Mrs. Chen, this letter serves as formal notice that Chen's Landscaping and Design Services has failed to meet the contractual obligations outlined in Agreement 2847, B, dated March 15, 2023. Specifically, your company has not completed the installation of irrigation systems, hardscaping, and ornamental plantings for the Blackwell Meadows development project in Fairfield County. As per Section 7.3 of the aforementioned contract, failure to complete work within the specified timeline constitutes breach of contract. Blackwell Properties LLC is hereby pursuing legal action to recover damages in the amount of $847,000, plus legal fees and additional compensation for project delays. You have 30 days to respond to this notice or seek legal counsel. Failure to respond will result in default judgment. Sincerely, Victoria Hastings, ESQ Chief Counsel, Blackwell Properties LLC. $847,000. I read the number 3 times, certain I'd misunderstood. Maybe it was $8,470? Maybe there was a decimal point hiding somewhere in that cruel string of digits? But no. $847,000. I sank into one of our kitchen chairs, the ones David had refinished himself, sanding away years of family dinners and homework sessions and spilled soy sauce until the oak grain shone like honey. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out right there, face first into the Formica countertop we'd always meant to replace but never got around to. The Blackwell Meadows project. I remembered it, vaguely. David had been so excited when he'd landed that contract 1.5 years ago. It was the biggest project Chen's Landscaping had ever taken on, a luxury housing development with 20 custom homes, each on 2-acre lots, each requiring extensive landscaping work. Gardens, irrigation systems, stone walkways, the works. Margaret, he'd said, his eyes bright with that boyish enthusiasm that had made me fall in love with him back when we were both working at the plant nursery in New Haven, back when our biggest concern was whether we could afford a 1-bedroom apartment. This is it. This is the project that's going to set us up for retirement. Jenny won't have to worry about student loans. We can finally take that trip to Taiwan to visit my relatives. We never did take that trip. David had a massive heart attack 3 months after signing the Blackwell contract. He was 59 years old, loading bags of mulch into his truck at the crack of dawn, the way he'd done 1,000 times before. One of his crew members, Jose, found him slumped against the wheel, already gone. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolences, of Jenny flying in from grad school in California and clinging to me like she was a little girl again, of David's business partner Tom standing in the corner looking lost and helpless. Tom. I needed to call Tom. My fingers fumbled with my phone, a hand-me-down iPhone 8 that Jenny had given me when she upgraded, patiently teaching me how to use FaceTime and explaining what the cloud meant even though I still didn't fully understand it. Margaret. Tom's voice was rough, like he'd just woken up even though it was 2 in the afternoon. Since David died, Tom had been struggling. They'd been partners for 15 years, best friends even longer, and losing David had hit him almost as hard as it hit me. Tom, I got a letter. From Blackwell Properties. They're suing us for almost $1 million. Silence on the other end. Then, Jesus Christ. What happened with that project? I thought you were finishing it up. More silence. This one felt heavier, weighted with something I couldn't quite name. Tom, Margaret, I tried. After David passed, I tried to keep it going. But we were already behind schedule when he died, and then I couldn't do it alone. We need to hire another crew, rent equipment we didn't have, and the money from the other jobs barely covered payroll. I tried to reach out to Blackwell's people to explain the situation, to ask for an extension. They wouldn't even take my calls. I closed my eyes, pressing my forehead against my palm. How behind are we? Maybe 60% complete? We got the basic grading done, some of the irrigation roughed in. But the detailed work, the stonework, the plantings, Margaret, that's specialized stuff. That's what David did. That was his art. My throat tightened. Art. Yes, that's exactly what it was. David didn't just landscape. He created living paintings, carefully selecting plants for color and texture and seasonal interest, positioning stones like a sculptor, considering how the light would fall at different times of day. He'd studied traditional Chinese gardens, English cottage gardens, Japanese Zen gardens. He could make a suburban backyard look like something out of a magazine. And now they wanted nearly $1 million because he'd had the audacity to die before finishing their luxury development. What do we do? I whispered. You need a lawyer, Margaret. A good one. With what money, Tom? Do you know how much lawyers cost? Do you know how much I've got in the bank right now? I did know. Exactly $3,247.83 in checking. Another $17,000 in savings that I was supposed to be living on until I figured out what to do with the business, whether to try to keep it going or sell it or just let it fade away like David had faded away in that hospital bed after the paramedics had tried and failed to restart his beautiful, generous heart. There's got to be something we can do, Tom said, but he sounded as hopeless as I felt. After we hung up, I sat in that kitchen for what felt like hours, watching the afternoon light creep across the linoleum floor, thinking about all the times David had come home covered in dirt, smelling like grass and hard work, grinning as he showed me photos of his latest project. The letter sat on the table in front of me like a snake, coiled and ready to strike. 30 days to respond. 30 days to find a lawyer. I couldn't afford to fight a case I couldn't win against a man who probably spent more on his morning latte than I had in my entire bank account. I thought about calling Jenny, but she had her own problems. Student loans from her master's program, a teaching assistant position that barely paid minimum wage, a roommate situation in Berkeley that required her to pay rent in one of the most expensive cities in America. She sent me money when she could, despite my protests. I wasn't about to burden her with this. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed. The bed I'd shared with David for 3 decades, the bed that now felt too big and too empty, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me. Every creak and groan seemed to echo with accusation. You're failing. You're losing everything. You couldn't even keep his business alive for 2 years. At 3 a.m., I got up and went to David's office, really just a converted bedroom where he kept his files and blueprints and landscaping magazines. I'd barely touched it since he died. It still smelled like him, like Old Spice deodorant and the orange-scented hand cleaner he used to get the dirt out from under his nails. I started pulling out files, looking for the Blackwell contract. I had to understand what I was dealing with, even if the legal language made my head spin. The contract was buried in a filing cabinet, in a folder labeled Blackwell Meadows. Big one. David's handwriting. His enthusiasm captured in those 3 words and an exclamation point. I spread the pages across his desk, my reading glasses perched on my nose, and started reading by the light of his old desk lamp. 27 pages of dense legal text. Timelines and specifications and penalty clauses and arbitration agreements. Words like indemnification and force majeure and liquidated damages that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. But one section jumped out at me, highlighted in yellow by David's own hand. Section 7.3. In the event that contractor fails to complete the work by the specified completion date, owner may, at its sole discretion, pursue legal remedies including but not limited to a. Completion of the work by alternative contractors, with costs charged to contractor. B. Liquidated damages at a rate of $5,000 per day for each day beyond the completion date. C. Termination of this agreement with full recovery of all costs, fees, and anticipated lost profits resulting from said breach. The completion date, according to the contract, was August 15th, 2024. Today was February 18th, 2025. 6 months late. I did the math in my head, my heart sinking with each calculation. If they were charging liquidated damages, that was over $900,000 right there. They were actually being generous at $847,000. I kept reading, page after page of legalese, until my eyes burned and the words started swimming on the page. And then, buried in Section 12, I found something that made me sit up straighter. Section 12.7. In the event of contractor's death or permanent disability during the term of this agreement, owner and contractor's estate shall enter into good faith negotiations to modify timelines and deliverables, taking into account reasonable circumstances and the unique nature of contractors' specialized skills and expertise. Good faith negotiations. Reasonable circumstances. Unique nature of specialized skills. They were supposed to negotiate with me. They were supposed to consider that David had died, that his skills were irreplaceable, that circumstances had fundamentally changed. Instead, they'd sent me a letter demanding nearly $1 million with all the warmth and compassion of a mobster demanding protection money. I grabbed my phone and took pictures of that section, my hands shaking so badly that the first 3 photos came out blurry. Then I carefully put the contract back in its folder, turned off the light, and went back to bed. I still couldn't sleep, but now it was for a different reason. Now I was angry. The next morning, I drove to the Chinese Community Center in Bridgeport, a converted Victorian house on the east side that served as a gathering place for the local Chinese American community. It was where I'd first met David, actually at a Lunar New Year celebration back in 1991. I was a second-generation Chinese-American girl from a family that ran a restaurant in West Haven, and he was a first-generation immigrant who still spoke Mandarin at home with his parents. We'd bonded over our shared love of plants and our frustration with our mother's matchmaking attempts. The center was run by Mrs. Chun, no relation to David, despite sharing a surname, and her daughter Linda, who'd taken over most of the day-to-day operations after Mrs. Chun had a hip replacement the previous year. Linda was about my age, with silver streaks in her black hair that she wore proudly, refusing to dye them like so many of our friends did. Margaret. Linda looked up from the desk where she was sorting through a pile of flyers for an upcoming dumpling-making class. I haven't seen you in months. How are you holding up? The genuine concern in her voice almost broke me. I'd been avoiding the community center, avoiding everyone really, because I couldn't stand the pity in people's eyes, the careful way they asked how I was doing, like I was made of spun glass and might shatter at any moment. I need help, I said, and then, to my horror, I started crying right there in the entryway, tears streaming down my face while Linda rushed over and guided me to one of the worn couches in the common room. She didn't say anything, just handed me tissues and waited while I ugly cried into my hands, all the grief and fear and anger from the past 24 hours pouring out of me in great, shuddering sobs. When I finally got control of myself, I told her everything. About the letter, about the money I didn't have, about the contract and David's death, and how I was about to lose everything we'd built together. Linda listened, her face growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Do you know who Richard Blackwell is?" she asked finally. I shook my head. He's a piece of work. Started out with his father's construction company and built it into a real estate empire. Luxury developments, commercial properties, the whole thing. But he's got a reputation. People call him ruthless rich behind his back. He's sued contractors, architects, even his own partners. He once tied up a small concrete company in litigation for 3 years over a dispute about whether the sidewalks were exactly level. They went bankrupt before the case was even settled. My stomach dropped. So, I don't have a chance. I didn't say that. Linda leaned forward, her eyes intense. I said he has a reputation. But reputations can be deceived. And I know someone who might be able to help you. Linda, I can't afford a lawyer. I can barely afford my mortgage payment next month. This lawyer is different. Her name is Sarah Chin. Yes, another Chin, we're everywhere. And she works at a nonprofit that provides legal aid to small businesses and immigrants who can't afford traditional representation. She's been doing it for years, taking on cases nobody else will touch. Hope flickered in my chest, small and fragile as a candle flame in a storm. Do you think she'd take my case? I think she'd at least talk to you. Let me give her a call. Linda pulled out her phone, and 10 minutes later, I had an appointment for the following afternoon at a legal aid office in New Haven that I'd driven past 100 times without ever really noticing. I left the community center feeling like I could breathe again just a little bit. It wasn't much, but it was something. A thread to pull, a path forward when everything had felt like a dead end. That night, I did something I hadn't done since David died. I cooked a real meal. Not the frozen dinners or scrambled eggs that had constituted most of my diet for the past 2 years, but actual food. I made his favorite dish, mapo tofu with ground pork and plenty of Sichuan peppercorns, the kind that makes your mouth tingle and your eyes water. I set a place for myself at the table, just one place, because pretending he was still here would have been too painful, and I ate slowly, savoring each bite, remembering all the times he'd told me my mapo tofu was better than his mother's, a lie, but a kind one. And then I did something else I hadn't done in 2 years. I went into our bedroom and opened the closet where David's clothes still hung, exactly as he'd left them. I buried my face in one of his flannel shirts and breathed in deep, even though his scent had mostly faded, replaced by the smell of dust and cedar from the closet. I'm going to fight for this, I whispered into the empty fabric. I'm going to fight for what we built. I'm not going to let some billionaire bully take it away from us. The shirt didn't answer, of course. But somehow, saying the words out loud made them real, made them a promise I couldn't break. The legal aid office was in a converted storefront in a part of New Haven that real estate agents like to call up and coming, which meant it used to be rough, but was slowly being gentrified by coffee shops and yoga studios. The sign in the window read New Haven Community Legal Services in both English and Spanish. Inside, the waiting room was packed. A young Hispanic woman with a toddler on her lap, bouncing him gently while he whined about wanting goldfish crackers. An elderly black man in a fedora, clutching a stack of papers. A middle-aged white woman who kept glancing at her phone and sighing dramatically. I gave my name to the receptionist, a young man with kind eyes and a nose ring, and settled into one of the plastic chairs to wait. 20 minutes later, a door opened and a woman emerged. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with short black hair, glasses with thick black frames, and an air of barely contained energy, like a hummingbird in human form. Margaret Chen, she called, scanning the waiting room. I stood, smoothing down my blouse nervously. That's me. Sarah Chen. Come on back. Her office was tiny and chaotic, every surface covered with files and legal pads and empty coffee cups. A framed law degree from Yale hung on one wall, next to a child's drawing that said "To Mommy" in crayon. Sorry about the mess, Sarah said, clearing a stack of papers from the chair across from her desk. I keep meaning to organize, but then another case comes in and... She shrugged, gesturing at the organized chaos around us. So, Linda told me a bit about your situation. Why don't you start from the beginning? I told her everything. About David, about the business, about the Blackwell contract and the letter, and the impossible amount of money they were demanding. I told her about Section 12.7, the clause about good faith negotiations that they'd completely ignored. Sarah listened intently, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally asking questions for clarification. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and tapped her pen against her teeth, thinking. Okay, she said finally. Here's the situation. Technically, they have a case. Your husband's company did fail to complete the work. But, and this is a big but, they also have an obligation under the contract to negotiate in good faith given the circumstances of your husband's death. The fact that they didn't even try to work with you is a problem for them. So, I have a chance? Maybe. Here's what concerns me. Richard Blackwell has very deep pockets and a team of lawyers who get paid whether they win or lose. His strategy is usually to bury the opposition in paperwork and legal fees until they can't afford to fight anymore. Even if we're in the right, He can make this incredibly expensive and time-consuming. My heart sank. So it's hopeless. I didn't say that. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. I said that's his strategy. But I didn't become a legal aid attorney because I like easy cases. I became one because I'm sick of watching bullies push around people who can't fight back. I can't pay you, I said quietly. I don't know if Linda explained, but I barely have enough money to— Margaret. Sarah held up her hand. Our fees are based on a sliding scale tied to income. Given your situation, your cost would be minimal, possibly nothing. That's not what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is whether you're ready for a fight. Because this isn't going to be easy. Blackwell is going to come at us with everything he's got. He's going to try to intimidate you, to make you feel small and stupid, and like you should just give up. Are you prepared for that? I thought about David's laugh, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. I thought about the business he'd built from nothing, working 14-hour days and coming home with dirt under his nails and pride in his eyes. I thought about that letter, that cold, dismissive letter demanding nearly $1 million without a single acknowledgement that a human being had died. I'm ready, I said. Sarah smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. Good. Then let's go to war. The first few weeks were a crash course in legal terminology and procedure. Sarah filed a response to Blackwell's lawsuit, asserting that they'd violated the good faith negotiation clause and that their damages claim was excessive and punitive. She also filed a counterclaim arguing that Blackwell had engaged in bad faith dealing and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It's a long shot, she admitted during one of our meetings at her office. But sometimes you have to swing for the fences. We gathered evidence. Tom provided detailed records of his attempts to contact Blackwell Properties after David died, including a dozen emails and phone messages that had gone unanswered. We collected David's medical records, the death certificate, documentation of the funeral expenses, and the chaos that had followed. Sarah also hired an expert witness, a retired landscape architect named Gordon who'd worked in the industry for 40 years. He reviewed the Blackwell Meadows site and produced a report stating that the work completed so far was of exceptional quality and that, given the specialized nature of David's skills, the delays were not only understandable, but inevitable. What David did wasn't just landscaping. Gordon told me when we met at a diner in Milford to go over his report. He was a grandfatherly man with white hair and weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime working outdoors. It was craftsmanship. Art. You can't just hire any landscaping crew to replicate that kind of work. Blackwell knew what he was getting when he hired David. He was paying for something unique. But Blackwell's team had their own experts, their own reports claiming that any competent landscaping company could have finished the work, that the delays were inexcusable, that the damages they were claiming were entirely justified. The legal bills started piling up, even with Sarah's reduced fees. Expert witness reports cost money. Filing fees cost money. Every motion, every response, every document requested in discovery, it all cost money I didn't have. I started cutting corners everywhere I could. I stopped heating the house above 60 degrees in the winter. I bought generic brands at the grocery store and started clipping coupons like my mother used to do. I sold David's truck, the Ford F-150 he'd loved, that still smelled like grass clippings and soil, to a buyer on Craigslist for half what it was worth because I needed the money immediately. Jenny found out what was happening when she called one night in early April, and I made the mistake of answering while I was going through bills at the kitchen table, stress crying over a credit card statement. Mom, what's wrong? I tried to brush it off, to tell her everything was fine, but she'd inherited her father's stubborn streak, and she wouldn't let it go. Finally, I told her everything. Why didn't you tell me? Her voice was sharp with hurt. I could have helped. I could have. Baby, you have your own expenses. Your own life. This isn't your burden. Dad was my father. That business represents his life's work. Of course it's my burden. Of course I want to help. She sent me a check for $2,000 the following week. Money I knew she didn't have. Money she'd probably borrowed or pulled from student loan refunds. I cried when I deposited it, grateful and guilty in equal measure. but it was barely a drop in the bucket compared to what we were up against. In May, we were ordered to attend mediation, a last-ditch attempt to settle the case before it went to trial. The mediation was held in a neutral conference room in a New Haven office building, the kind of aggressively bland corporate space with gray carpet and a table so shiny you could see a reflection in it. Sarah and I arrived 15 minutes early. I'd worn my best outfit, a navy blue suit I'd bought for David's funeral and hadn't worn since, paired with sensible pumps that pinched my toes. "Remember," Sarah said as we waited in the lobby, "the mediator is going to push both sides to compromise. They're going to make it seem like we're being unreasonable if we don't agree to pay something. But we have a strong case. Don't let them pressure you into agreeing to anything you're not comfortable with." I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. And then Richard Blackwell walked in. I'd looked him up online, of course, after Linda had told me about his reputation. I'd seen the photos of him at charity galas and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, always wearing an expensive suit and an expression that suggested he was mentally calculating the property value of everything around him. But seeing him in person was different. He was tall, maybe 6'3", with silver hair styled in that way rich white men have perfected, expensive but not too styled, suggesting casual wealth rather than earned. His suit probably cost more than my car. His watch definitely cost more than my car. He walked right past us without a glance, followed by Victoria Hastings, the lawyer who'd signed the letter, and two other attorneys I didn't recognize. They swept into the conference room like a conquering army. The mediator was a woman in her 60s named Judge Patterson, retired, who explained the ground rules in a calm, measured voice designed to make everyone feel like reasonable adults capable of reaching a reasonable compromise. We started with opening statements. Sarah spoke first, laying out our case. David's death, the specialized nature of his work, Blackwell's failure to negotiate in good faith, the excessive nature of the damages claim. Then Victoria Hastings stood up, and her opening statement was a masterclass in twisting the knife. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward breach of contract case. Chen's Landscaping signed an agreement. They accepted a substantial down payment, $150,000, for work they failed to complete. The fact that Mr. Chen unfortunately passed away is tragic, yes, but it doesn't absolve the business of its contractual obligations. Mrs. Chen had options. She could have hired another contractor to finish the work. She could have returned the down payment. Instead, she's done nothing for over a year and a half, forcing my client to incur substantial costs and delays for an entire development project. Other contractors have had to wait. Homebuyers have been disappointed. The ripple effects of this breach have been significant." She sat down, looking satisfied, like a cat that had just cornered a mouse. Judge Patterson turned to me. "Mrs. Chen, I'd like to hear from you directly. Can you explain to me what happened after your husband passed away?" All eyes turned to me. My palms were sweating. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. My voice came out as a whisper. I cleared my throat and tried again. I was in shock. For months, I was just trying to survive, to figure out how to pay the mortgage and keep the business from collapsing completely. David's partner Tom tried to keep the Blackwell project going, but without David's expertise, without his vision for the landscape, it wasn't possible. We reached out to Blackwell's office multiple times, asking for a meeting, asking for understanding, asking for time to find a solution. No one ever called us back. "Mrs. Chen," Blackwell spoke for the first time, his voice smooth as silk and cold as ice. "I understand you're grieving. I do. But surely you understand that I can't run a business on sympathy. I have investors, deadlines, commitments. Your husband signed a contract. If he wasn't confident he could fulfill it, he shouldn't have signed it." Something in his tone, the casual dismissiveness, the implication that David had been careless or overconfident, ignited a spark of anger in my chest. "My husband," I said, my voice stronger now, "built his business over 25 years on reputation and quality. He never missed a deadline, never failed to deliver exceptional work. He was excited about your project. He called it his masterpiece. And then he died, Mr. Blackwell. His heart stopped while he was loading mulch for another job. He didn't choose to breach your contract. He died. Blackwell leaned back in his chair, studying me with the expression of someone examining a mildly interesting insect. Death is unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility to absorb the financial consequences of your husband's death. That's what insurance is for. That's what business contingency planning is for. We had insurance, I shot back. Life insurance that barely covered the funeral and a few months of mortgage payments. We didn't have key man insurance because we couldn't afford it, because we were a small business trying to compete in a market dominated by big companies with big resources. And you know what? Your contract, the one your lawyers wrote, specifically says that in the event of death or disability, both parties are supposed to negotiate in good faith. You didn't negotiate. You didn't even return our phone calls. You just waited until you could sue us for maximum damages. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not sympathy, nothing so human. But maybe respect? Interest? Like I'd revealed myself to be a slightly more complicated insect than he'd initially assumed. The good faith negotiation clause, Victoria Hastings interjected smoothly, is discretionary. It says we may negotiate, not that we must. And frankly, given Mrs. Chen's complete failure to communicate any viable plan for completing the work or returning the down payment, there was nothing to negotiate. That's not true, Sarah said firmly. We have documentation of multiple attempts to reach out to your office. 12 emails and 8 phone messages, to be exact, none of which received any response. Emails and messages to general office lines, Victoria countered. Not formal legal notice, through proper channels. Mrs. Chen didn't have a lawyer at that point, Sarah said. She was a grieving widow trying to navigate a complex situation. The fact that she didn't follow exact legal protocols doesn't negate her good faith attempts to communicate. Judge Patterson held up her hand. Let's take a break. I'm going to meet with each side separately, see if we can find some common ground. She met with Blackwell's team first. Sarah and I waited in a smaller conference room down the hall, drinking bad coffee from a Keurig machine and not talking much. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. After 45 minutes, Judge Patterson came to our room. Here's where we are, she said, settling into a chair across from us. Blackwell is willing to reduce the damages claim to $400,000 if you agree to settle today. They'll also agree to a payment plan, though they want the full amount within 5 years. $400,000. Half of the original amount, but still more money than I'd ever had in my entire life. Still enough to bankrupt me, to force me to sell the house, to destroy any hope of maintaining David's business. What if we go to trial? I asked. Judge Patterson gave me a sympathetic look. Mrs. Chun, I'll be frank with you. Trials are expensive, time-consuming, and unpredictable. Even if you have a strong case, and I'm not saying you do or don't, there's always risk. Blackwell has resources to drag this out for years. Can you afford that, financially and emotionally? The answer was no. Of course it was no. But something in me, maybe David's stubborn streak, maybe my own anger at the injustice of it all, wouldn't let me give up. What would it take for them to walk away completely? I asked. Sarah looked at me sharply. Margaret. What would it take? I repeated. Judge Patterson sighed. I can ask, but I'll tell you right now, Blackwell doesn't strike me as someone who walks away from anything. His entire reputation is built on winning. Just ask, I said quietly. She left, and Sarah turned to me. Margaret, are you sure about this? $400,000 is still terrible, but it's better than the alternative. If we go to trial and lose, then I lose everything anyway, I finished. At least this way, I'll know I fought. Sarah's expression softened. Okay, then we fight. Judge Patterson returned 20 minutes later, and I could tell from her face that the answer was no before she even spoke. He's not budging. $400,000 is his final offer. He says, she paused, looking uncomfortable. He says that he's already being more than generous, and if you don't take it, he'll make sure the trial destroys whatever's left of your husband's business reputation. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Tell him, I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands, that my husband's reputation was built on integrity and quality work, and no amount of money or threats can change that. We'll see him in court. Sarah and I left the mediation in silence, walking through the parking garage to our cars. When we reached mine, a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door, she finally spoke. That was brave. Maybe crazy, but brave. I laughed, a sound without much humor. I'm 57 years old, Sarah. I've got maybe $8,000 in the bank, a mortgage I can barely afford, and I just turned down the only settlement offer I'm likely to get. I don't feel brave. I feel terrified. Good, Sarah said. Terrified people fight harder. Listen, I'm going to do some more digging. There's something about this whole situation that doesn't add up. Blackwell's being too aggressive, too personal. Usually in cases like this, the company just writes off the loss and moves on. But he's pushing this hard, and I want to know why. Over the next few weeks, Sarah did what she called discovery. Legal speak for digging through every document, email, and record related to the Blackwell Meadows project. She requested financial records, development plans, correspondence, everything. Blackwell's team fought her every step of the way, filing motions to limit discovery, claiming documents were privileged or irrelevant. But Sarah was relentless, arguing every motion, pushing every boundary. And then, in late June, she found something. I was at home, trying to distract myself by weeding the garden, David's garden, the one he designed and planted over the years, a miniature showcase of his talents. The roses were blooming, deep reds and soft pinks, exactly as he'd planned them. The Japanese maple he'd planted for our 20th anniversary cast dappled shade over the stone bench where we used to sit on summer evenings.
My phone rang. Sarah.
Margaret, I need you to come to my office.
Now.
There's something you need to see. The urgency in her voice sent my heart racing. What is it? What did you find? Not over the phone. Just come. I dropped the hand trowel I'd been using and drove to New Haven faster than I probably should have, my mind spinning with possibilities. Had she found something good? Something terrible? Had Blackwell discovered some new way to destroy me? When I arrived at her office, Sarah was practically vibrating with energy. She had documents spread across every surface, sticky notes and highlighter marks everywhere. Okay, she said, pulling out a chair for me. You need to sit down for this. I sat, gripping the armrests. So, I've been going through the financial records for the Blackwell Meadows development. Something about the timeline bothered me. Your husband signed the contract in March 2023. He started work in April. He died in June. But here's what's interesting. Blackwell filed for permits for that development in January 2023. Okay, I said slowly, not understanding. Margaret, the permits he filed, they weren't for the development as you knew it. They were for a completely different project. A smaller one, with only 10 homes instead of 20. And the landscaping specifications were much simpler. Basic residential stuff, not the elaborate custom work David was contracted to do. My mind struggled to keep up. I don't understand what that means. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright. It means Blackwell changed the project after your husband started working. Significantly changed it. And I started wondering why. So I did some more digging and I found this. She pulled out a document and slid it across the desk. It was a zoning variance application, dated September 2023, 3 months after David died. Blackwell applied for a variance to increase the density of the development. He wanted to add not just 10 more homes, but 20 more. 30 homes total on the same parcel of land. And you want to know why the zoning board approved it? I shook my head, lost. Because he argued that the property already had significant landscaping infrastructure investments that would support a higher density development. He used David's work, your husband's beautiful, elaborate landscaping design, as justification for cramming more houses onto that land. Houses that will sell for over $2 million each. The implications slowly sank in. So, he needed David's work to get the variance?
Exactly.
And here's the kicker. I found the timeline of when he started pushing for the variance. It was right after David died. He saw an opportunity. With David gone, the landscaping wouldn't be finished. He could use the partial completion as justification for the variance, then either force you to finish it for the original contract price or sue you and hire cheaper contractors to complete basic work while keeping the elaborate design David had already started. But it means he never expected David to finish the original project according to the original timeline. He was already planning to expand the development. And when David died, it actually worked in his favor. He gets the variance based on David's work. He sues you for damages that he can write off as a business loss. He completes the landscaping with cheaper labor, and he sells 30 houses instead of 20. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. He profited from David's death. More than that, I started looking at the numbers. With 30 homes selling at $2.3 million each, that's nearly $70 million in revenue. The landscaping work, even if he paid another company to complete it according to David's design, would cost maybe $500,000. So he's suing you for $847,000, which is more than it would cost him to finish the work. He's literally making money off your husband's death while bankrupting his widow. The room spun. I gripped the edge of Sarah's desk, trying to steady myself. Can we use this? I whispered. In court. Oh, we're going to do more than use it. We're going to bury him with it. This shows bad faith. It shows fraudulent inducement. It potentially shows that he manipulated the entire situation for profit. Margaret, this changes everything. But even as hope flared in my chest, doubt crept in. Sarah, he's got an army of lawyers. They'll find a way to explain this, to make it sound reasonable. Let them try, Sarah said fiercely. Because I'm going to make sure the judge sees exactly what kind of man Richard Blackwell is. I'm going to make sure everyone sees. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about David, about how excited he'd been about the Blackwell project. Had he known? Had he suspected that Blackwell was planning something? I got up and went back to his office, back to the filing cabinet. There had to be more. Some note. Some record, something that would help us. I went through every file, every folder. And then, in a manila envelope labeled Blackwell, Misk, I found something that made my heart stop. It was a letter, handwritten, from David to me, dated May 2023, a month before he died. Dear Margaret, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I know you think I'm being morbid, keeping this letter in my files, but after Dad's heart attack last year, I've been thinking about being prepared. I need you to know something about the Blackwell project. About a month ago, Richard Blackwell came to the site while I was working. He walked around looking at everything I'd done, and then he told me he was thinking about expanding the development. He asked if my design could scale up to support more homes. Margaret, I told him no. I told him the design was specifically calibrated for 20 homes, that adding more would destroy the aesthetic balance, that the irrigation and drainage systems weren't designed for higher density. He didn't like that answer. He offered me more money, a lot more money, to redesign everything for a larger development. I said I'd think about it. But honey, I didn't want to do it. This design is my masterpiece. It's everything I've learned in 25 years of landscaping. Making it bigger, denser, more commercial, it would ruin it. I was planning to tell him no. I was going to finish the original project exactly as we'd agreed, and then be done with him. But I'm worried. There's something about the way he looked at me when I said I'd think about it. Something calculating. Like he was already figuring out his next move. If anything happens to me, if somehow this project becomes a problem for you, I want you to know, I designed this landscape with love and integrity. Every plant, every stone, every curve of the path, it all means something. Don't let him take that and turn it into something cheap and commercial. I love you, Margaret. I've loved you since the first day I saw you at the Lunar New Year party, laughing with your friends and eating too many dumplings. Whatever happens, remember that we built something good together. Our life, our family, the business, it's all been good. Take care of yourself. And tell Jenny I'm proud of her, always. Love, David. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face, David's handwriting blurring before my eyes. He'd known. He'd suspected Blackwell was planning something. And now Blackwell was using David's work, David's masterpiece, to line his own pockets while trying to destroy everything David had built. I took a picture of the letter with my phone and sent it to Sarah with a single message: "Call me first thing tomorrow. I found something." Sarah called at 7 a.m. I'd been awake since 5, drinking coffee and rereading David's letter over and over. "Margaret, this is incredible," she said, her voice crackling with excitement. "This establishes that Blackwell was already planning to change the project while David was alive. It shows David refused to compromise his design. And it strongly suggests, that Blackwell may have had ulterior motives for the timeline and specifications in the contract." "Can we use it in court?" "Absolutely. It's direct evidence of Blackwell's intent and David's professional integrity. Combined with the zoning variance documents, this paints a very clear picture." "But Margaret," she paused, "I need you to prepare yourself. When we introduce this, Blackwell's team is going to come after us hard. They're going to try to discredit it, to claim it's fabricated or irrelevant. They're going to make this ugly." "Let them," I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. David wrote this letter because he was worried about exactly what ended up happening. I'm not going to let his concerns be silenced just because he's not here to speak for himself. "Okay then," Sarah said. "Let's go to war." The trial was scheduled for September, which gave us 3 months to prepare. Sarah filed amended complaints, adding claims of fraudulent inducement and bad faith dealing. She subpoenaed more documents, more witnesses, building a case that Blackwell hadn't just breached the good faith negotiation clause. He'd manipulated the entire situation from the beginning. Blackwell's legal team responded with a blizzard of motions. Motions to dismiss. Motions to exclude evidence. Motions to sanction Sarah for frivolous claims. Each motion required a response. Each response required hours of Sarah's time and money I didn't have. I took a part-time job at the garden center where David and I had first met, working the register and helping customers choose plants. It didn't pay much, but it was something. And being around the plants, the soil, the green growing things that David had loved, it felt like being close to him again. My coworkers at the garden center were mostly young people working their way through college, but there was one other woman my age, a widow named Patricia, whose husband had died of cancer 3 years earlier. We'd work side by side, ringing up purchases and hauling bags of potting soil, and sometimes during our breaks, we'd talk about what it was like to lose your partner, to navigate the world alone after decades of togetherness. "You're doing something brave," Patricia told me one afternoon in July, after I told her about the lawsuit. "Most people would have just given up, let the lawyers take everything. But you're fighting. Your husband would be proud." Would he? I wondered sometimes, late at night when the fear got too big to ignore. Or would he have wanted me to take the settlement, to preserve what little we had left, to prioritize survival over principle? But then I'd reread his letter, and I'd know. David had been a man of principle. He'd turned down Blackwell's money because it would have compromised his vision, his integrity. How could I honor his memory by doing anything less? In August, a month before the trial, something unexpected happened. I got a call from a man named James Morton, who introduced himself as a former contractor who'd worked for Blackwell Properties. "Mrs. Chun," he said, his voice nervous, "I heard about your lawsuit, about what Blackwell is doing to you. And I thought you should know you're not the first." My hand tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" 5 years ago, my company did electrical work on a Blackwell commercial property. Everything was going fine until about halfway through the project, when Blackwell suddenly changed the specifications. Wanted additional work that wasn't in the original contract. When I said it would cost extra, he refused to pay. Then he claimed we'd breached the contract by not completing the original scope of work, even though the scope had changed. He sued us for $500,000. What happened? I couldn't afford to fight him. I had to declare bankruptcy. Lost my business, lost my house, nearly lost my marriage. And you know the worst part? After I went bankrupt, he hired another electrical contractor to finish the job, for less money than he would have paid me. He made money off destroying me. My stomach churned. "Why didn't you fight?" I tried. But his lawyers, they're like a machine. They file motion after motion, they drag everything out, they make it so expensive that you can't afford to keep going. Most people give up. Most people don't have the resources to stand up to someone like Richard Blackwell. Mr. Morton, would you be willing to testify? To tell a judge what happened to you? Silence on the other end. Long, heavy silence. I don't know, he said finally. Blackwell scares me, Mrs. Chen. Even now, 5 years later, even though I've got nothing left for him to take, he scares me. He's got connections, money, power. He could make my life hell. He's already making my life hell, I said softly. But I'm going to fight him anyway. Because if people like us don't stand up to people like him, who will? More silence. Then, let me think about it.
Let me talk to my wife.
I'll call you back. He did call back, 3 days later, and agreed to testify. Sarah was ecstatic. Having another victim of Blackwell's tactics would strengthen our case immensely, showing a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. But when Blackwell's team found out about James Morton, and they found out quickly because discovery rules required us to disclose our witnesses, they went on the attack. They filed a motion claiming Morton's testimony was irrelevant because it involved a different type of project and different circumstances. They dug into Morton's background and found a DUI from 10 years ago, a bankruptcy filing, a messy divorce, all of which they planned to use to discredit him. They're trying to scare him off, Sarah said during one of our prep sessions in late August. They're showing him all the dirty laundry they'll air in court, all the ways they'll humiliate him. It's intimidation, pure and simple. Will he back out? I don't know. He's terrified. And I can't blame him. Testifying means putting himself through hell all over again. But James Morton didn't back out. When I called him to check in to give him an out if he needed it, he said something that stuck with me. My wife asked me what kind of man I wanted to be. The kind who stays silent and lets bullies win, or the kind who speaks up even when it's hard. I've been the first kind for 5 years, Mrs. Chen. Maybe it's time I tried being the second kind. The week before trial, I barely slept. I'd lie awake running through testimony in my head, imagining all the ways it could go wrong, all the things Blackwell's lawyers would say to make me look stupid or greedy or like I was playing the victim card. Jenny flew in from California, insisting she needed to be there for the trial. She stayed in her old bedroom, and having her in the house was both a comfort and a reminder of everything I stood to lose. This house, with its memories and David's garden and the life we'd built, if we lost the trial, I'd have to sell it to pay the judgment. Jenny would have no childhood home to come back to. Mom, she said the night before the trial started, as we sat at the kitchen table drinking tea, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know I'm proud of you. Dad would be proud of you. Your father would think I was crazy for not taking the settlement, I said, trying to smile. No, Jenny said firmly. Dad spent his whole life standing up for what he believed in. Standing up for quality and integrity and doing things the right way, even when it was harder and less profitable. You're doing the same thing. You're fighting for his legacy. That's not crazy. That's love. I reached across the table and took her hand, this daughter of mine who'd grown into such a strong, wise woman. When did you get so smart? She smiled, tears in her eyes. I had good teachers. That night, I went to David's office one last time before the trial. I sat in his chair, surrounded by his books and blueprints and photos of his completed projects. And I talked to him the way I sometimes did when the grief got too big to carry alone. I hope I'm doing the right thing, I whispered to the empty room. I hope this is what you would have wanted. Tomorrow, I'm going to stand in front of a judge and fight for everything you built. And I'm terrified, David. I'm so terrified of losing, of letting you down, of proving that I'm not strong enough to carry on without you. The room didn't answer, of course. But as I sat there in the darkness, I could almost feel his presence, steady and reassuring, the way it had always been. And I knew, deep in my bones, that I was doing the right thing. Win or lose, I was doing the right thing. The courthouse was an imposing concrete building in downtown New Haven, all sharp angles and cold fluorescent lighting. Sarah and I arrived early, at 8 a.m., even though the trial wasn't scheduled to start until 9:30. Jenny came with us, dressed in a simple black dress, her hand gripping mine as we walked through the metal detectors and took the elevator up to the third floor. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, not like the grand spaces you see on TV. Wooden benches, a judge's bench that looked more like a really tall desk, fluorescent lights that hummed faintly. It smelled like old paper and nervous sweat. Blackwell and his legal team were already there, clustered around their table, like a military unit preparing for battle. 3 lawyers in expensive suits, leather briefcases open, documents organized in neat stacks. And Richard Blackwell himself, looking as comfortable and confident as if he owned the courtroom. Which, given his wealth and influence, maybe he did. He glanced over at me as I entered, and for just a moment, our eyes met. I expected to see contempt, or anger, or that calculating coldness I'd seen at the mediation. Instead, I saw something like curiosity. Like I was a puzzle he hadn't quite figured out yet. Then he looked away, turning to murmur something to Victoria Hastings, who smiled thinly and nodded. Judge Martha Reynolds entered promptly at 9:30, a black woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. "All rise," the bailiff called, and we did. Judge Reynolds settled into her chair and looked out at the courtroom over her reading glasses. "Good morning. We're here for Chen versus Blackwell Properties, case number 2024, CV 7841. Are both parties ready to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah and Victoria said in unison.
Good.
"Ms. Hastings, you represent the defendant and counterclaimant. You may proceed with your opening statement." Victoria stood, buttoning her suit jacket in one smooth motion. She was polished, professional, and terrifyingly competent. "Thank you, Your Honor. This case is about accountability. About honoring one's commitments. About the basic principle that when you sign a contract, you're expected to fulfill that contract or face the consequences." She walked toward the jury box, except there was no jury in this case. It was a bench trial, meaning the judge alone would decide, but Victoria was clearly used to performing for juries and adjusted her positioning toward Judge Reynolds instead. David Chen, may he rest in peace, was by all accounts a skilled landscaper. When Blackwell Properties entered into a contract with Chen's Landscaping in March 2023, we did so in good faith, believing that Mr. Chen and his company could deliver the high-quality landscaping work specified in that contract. We paid a substantial down payment, $150,000, in good faith. But Mr. Chen's tragic death in June 2023 does not absolve his business of its contractual obligations. Mrs. Chen had options. She could have hired another qualified landscaping company to complete the work. She could have negotiated a timeline extension if she needed time to arrange for continuation of the project. She could have, as a last resort, returned the down payment that my client had provided. Victoria paused, letting her words sink in. Instead, Mrs. Chen did nothing. For 18 months, she allowed the project to languish incomplete, forcing my client to delay an entire development that affected not just Blackwell Properties, but homebuyers waiting to move into their new homes, other contractors waiting to complete their own work, investors who had committed substantial capital based on projected completion dates. She turned slightly, gesturing toward me without quite looking at me. "I understand Mrs. Chen is grieving. Anyone would. But grief does not give one the right to ignore legal obligations and cause substantial financial harm to others. My client has attempted to be reasonable. We offered a reduced settlement at mediation. Mrs. Chen refused. We are now forced to pursue full damages, $847,000, plus legal fees, to compensate for the very real financial harm caused by this breach of contract. The law is clear, Your Honor. When a contract is breached, the injured party is entitled to damages. That's not cruelty. That's justice." "Thank you." She sat down looking satisfied. Judge Reynolds turned to Sarah. "Ms. Chen, your opening statement." Sarah stood, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she gathered her notes. But when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "Your Honor, this case is indeed about accountability, but not the kind Ms. Hastings described. This case is about a wealthy, powerful real estate developer who saw an opportunity in a widow's grief. An opportunity to manipulate circumstances for his own profit while destroying the legacy of a hardworking immigrant who spent 25 years building a business based on integrity and craftsmanship. Victoria Hastings started to rise, probably to object, but Judge Reynolds held up a hand. "I'll allow it. Continue, Ms. Chun." "Thank you, Your Honor. The evidence will show that Richard Blackwell didn't just fail to negotiate in good faith with Mrs. Chun after her husband's death. He actively planned to profit from the situation. While David Chun was still alive, Mr. Blackwell approached him about expanding the development. Mr. Chun refused because it would compromise the integrity of his design. After Mr. Chun's death, Mr. Blackwell used the partially completed landscaping as justification to obtain a zoning variance that allowed him to increase the development from 20 homes to 30 homes, homes that sell for over $2 million each. I watched Blackwell's face. For the first time, I saw a flicker of concern. The evidence will show that Mr. Blackwell made approximately $20 million in additional profit from this expanded development, profit that was only possible because of David Chun's work. And rather than honoring the contract's good faith negotiation clause, rather than working with a grieving widow who was trying her best to handle an impossible situation, Mr. Blackwell chose to sue for damages that exceed the actual cost of completing the work. Why? Because he could. Because he has a pattern of using litigation as a weapon against smaller contractors who can't afford to fight back. Sarah moved closer to the judge's bench. "Your Honor, we will prove that this isn't just a breach of contract case. It's a case about unconscionable behavior, about bad faith dealing, about a powerful man exploiting a vulnerable widow for profit. And we're asking this court to hold Richard Blackwell accountable, not just for breaching the good faith negotiation clause, but for the emotional and financial devastation he has deliberately inflicted on Mrs. Chun and her family." "Thank you." Sarah sat down beside me, and I reached over to squeeze her hand. She squeezed back. Judge Reynolds reviewed her notes for a moment, then looked up. "Ms. Hastings, you may call your first witness." "Your Honor, the defense calls Richard Blackwell." A murmur went through the courtroom. Apparently, it was unusual for the defense to call their own client first. But as Blackwell strode to the witness stand, I understood the strategy. He wanted to set the narrative, to establish himself as reasonable and sympathetic before we had a chance to dismantle his image. He was sworn in and settled into the witness chair with the ease of someone used to being in control of any room he entered. Victoria approached him with a kind of deference usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. "Mr. Blackwell, can you tell the court about your experience in real estate development?" "I've been in the business for 32 years, Blackwell said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I started working for my father's construction company right out of college, learned the business from the ground up. Over the years, I've developed over 40 residential and commercial properties throughout Connecticut and neighboring states. Blackwell Properties employs over 200 people and has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in Connecticut's economy." "And the Blackwell Meadows development. Can you tell us about that project?" "Certainly. Blackwell Meadows was intended to be a luxury residential development in Fairfield County. High-end homes on 2-acre lots, appealing to executives and professionals looking for both privacy and proximity to New York City. We envisioned it as a showcase property, something that would set a new standard for luxury living in Connecticut." "And why did you select Chun's landscaping for this project?" "David Chun came highly recommended. I'd seen some of his work on other properties, and I was impressed by his attention to detail, his artistic vision. This was a premium development, and I wanted premium landscaping. I was willing to pay for the best, and at the time, I believed David Chun was the best." The past tense stung.
Was the best.
As if David's death had somehow diminished his accomplishments. "Did you and Mr. Chun have a clear contract outlining the scope of work and timeline?" "We did. A very detailed contract, prepared by our legal team, reviewed, and signed by Mr. Chun. He had every opportunity to negotiate terms, to ask questions, to request modifications. He signed it without any reservations." "And when Mr. Chun passed away, what did you do?" Blackwell shifted slightly, arranging his features into something approximating sympathy. "I was very sorry to hear about his death. Truly. I sent flowers to the funeral, a condolence card. But I also had a business to run, investors to answer to, deadlines to meet. I waited a reasonable period, several months, to allow Mrs. Chin time to grieve. But when there was no communication, no plan for completing the work, I had to protect my company's interests. Did you attempt to reach out to Mrs. Chun? My team did, yes. We sent several communications through proper legal channels. We received no substantive response. I wanted to scream, "Liar!" But Sarah put a calming hand on my arm. Mr. Blackwell, the plaintiff has alleged that you manipulated this situation for profit, that you used Mr. Chen's death as an opportunity to expand the development.
How do you respond to that?
Blackwell's expression hardened slightly, the first crack in his carefully maintained composure. That's absurd and frankly offensive. I'm a businessman, not a monster. The decision to pursue a zoning variance for additional homes was made based on market analysis and investor interest. It had nothing to do with Mr. Chen's death. Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. Your witness, Ms. Chen. Sarah stood, gathering her notes, and walked toward the witness stand. Blackwell watched her approach with the expression of a lion watching a particularly naive gazelle wander into range. Mr. Blackwell, Sarah began, you testified that you sent flowers and a condolence card to Mr. Chen's funeral. Do you remember what the card said? Blackwell blinked, clearly not expecting that question. I don't recall the exact wording. It was a standard condolence message. Let me refresh your memory. Sarah pulled out a photograph and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Reynolds and then to Blackwell. This is the card you sent. It's been preserved in Mrs. Chen's family photo album. Can you read what it says? Blackwell looked at the photo, and I saw color rise in his cheeks. With sympathy on your loss. Richard Blackwell, Blackwell Properties. That's what it says. With sympathy on your loss, Sarah repeated. Not deepest sympathy, or heartfelt condolences. Just with sympathy. And it's signed with your company name. Mr. Blackwell, did you personally select this card, or did an assistant handle it? I don't see how that's relevant. Please answer the question. An assistant handled it. I have a large organization. I can't personally manage every detail. So, you didn't personally send condolences. Your company did. As a formality. I was busy. Too busy to take 5 minutes to write a personal note to the widow of a man who was creating what you yourself called premium landscaping for your showcase property. Blackwell's jaw tightened. I sent what I considered appropriate. Sarah let that hang in the air for a moment before moving on. Mr. Blackwell, you testified that you waited several months after Mr. Chen's death before taking legal action. Let's be precise. Mr. Chen died on June 12, 2023. When did you first contact Mrs. Chen about the project? I'd have to check the records. Let me help you. The first communication from your office to Mrs. Chen was dated February 3, 2025. The demand letter threatening legal action. That's almost 20 months after Mr. Chen's death. Does that sound like several months to you? We were monitoring the situation. You were waiting. You were waiting to see if Mrs. Chen would somehow complete the project or give up entirely, weren't you? Because either way, you would benefit. That's not. Mr. Blackwell, isn't it true that you approached David Chen in May 2023, just weeks before his death, and asked him to redesign the landscaping to accommodate a larger development? Blackwell's expression went carefully blank. I may have discussed future possibilities with him. You didn't discuss possibilities. You asked him to modify his design to support 30 homes instead of 20. And Mr. Chen refused. Isn't that correct? I don't recall the exact